The 8th of December, 1914. Port Stanley, in the Falkland Islands, at the bottom of the Atlantic. Smoke is rising on the northern horizon, and with every minute it thickens. Out there, steaming straight for the harbor, is the most dangerous German squadron on any ocean. 5 cruisers under the flag of Vice Admiral Maximilian von Spee. 5 weeks earlier, those ships destroyed a British squadron off the coast of Chile. They sent 1,661 sailors to the bottom, without losing a single man of their own. Inside the harbor lie 2 great warships with colliers lashed alongside, and the decks of both are buried under coal dust. They coaled through the night, their fires are banked, and the steam pressure has fallen almost to nothing. They cannot move. The German admiral is steaming directly at them, and he still does not know they are there. He is coming to destroy a coaling station and a wireless mast, because his intelligence told him the islands were held by one obsolete battleship. The intelligence was wrong. In that harbor lie HMS Invincible and HMS Inflexible, and they are neither cruisers nor battleships in any sense the world understood. It would take years to settle on a name for them. Battlecruisers. Ships carrying the guns of a battleship on the speed of a cruiser, throwing a shell of 850 pounds against von Spee's 238. Within 8 hours, his entire squadron will be lying on the floor of the South Atlantic. He will be dead, along with his flagship and both of his sons. There is only one question that matters. How did those ships get here before he did? The answer was written 8 years before that morning, and it explains everything that follows. To understand that harbor, go back 5 weeks and 8,000 miles north. On the 1st of November 1914, Rear Admiral Sir Christopher Cradock took 4 ships along the Chilean coast, hunting a single German light cruiser. Admiralty intelligence reported that the Leipzig was working the trade routes alone, and Cradock went after her. Von Spee's entire squadron was coming the other way. Cradock had allowed for exactly this, and had written to the Admiralty about it several times, with specific figures. His ships were inferior to the Germans in rate of fire, in range, and in speed, and he said so in plain language. The Admiralty replied with telegrams that could be read 2 different ways. The problem lay in how the Admiralty framed the task. Cradock was to find and destroy the German squadron, and at the same time he was not to hazard his ships beyond necessity. Those 2 instructions contradicted each other outright. The man expected to resolve the contradiction sat 8,000 miles from London, without a single ship capable of carrying out even the first of them. He was promised the armored cruiser Defense as reinforcement, and Defense never came. What he got instead was the old battleship Canopus, good for 16 knots. She could not keep pace with any ship that would fight in the coming action. Dragging her behind the squadron meant handing the enemy freedom of maneuver, and Cradock sent Canopus down to the Falklands to coal. He went on to Coronel himself. Historians have argued about that decision for over a century, and part of the answer sits outside tactics altogether. Not long before, Rear Admiral Troubridge had been court-martialed for declining action against a superior enemy, and the whole Navy had watched the case. Cradock's fellow officers all reached for the same phrase when they described him: constitutionally incapable of refusing a fight. To a friend, he wrote plainly that if he met von Spee without reinforcement, he would attack anyway. Both of his largest ships had been pulled out of reserve in the first weeks of the war. Good Hope and Monmouth were armored cruisers of the previous generation, and half their crews were mobilized reservists who had barely fired those guns in anger. Coming at them were Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. Those 2 ships had twice won the Kaiser's Cup for gunnery in the German Navy, and behind that prize sat a measurable result. Their gunners fired 3 salvos a minute and could put a shell where they wanted it at 8 to 12,000 meters. The crews had served together for years, and they knew their guns and each other. Fourth in Cradock's line came Otranto, an armed passenger liner of 12,000 tons. She carried 8 guns of 4.7 inches, no armor whatsoever, and presented a target the length of 1.5 football pitches. Cradock released her before the action because keeping her in the line simply meant killing her crew. Fifth was Glasgow, a modern light cruiser, the only ship in the British formation that made better than 25 knots. At 4:30 in the afternoon, the two squadrons sighted each other, and from that moment von Spee stopped hurrying. Von Spee was a gunnery specialist by trade, and that was exactly what had brought him command of the finest shooting squadron in the Kaiser's navy. He looked at the position of the sun and understood that the battle should not begin yet. The sun stood in the west and was working down towards the horizon. Open fire now, and the light would come straight back into his own gunner's sights. Wait 3 hours, and the sun would set behind him while the British ships stood up as black silhouettes against a lit sky. He held the range and waited. Cradock understood exactly what was happening and could do nothing about it. Good Hope made 23 knots in perfect conditions. Scharnhorst made 22.5. And on that high western swell, the difference vanished entirely. Cradock could not force the action on his terms. He could not run, and waiting for different light was pointless. At 7 in the evening, Scharnhorst opened fire. By then, the sun sat directly behind the German ships, and the British layers were staring into a blinding disk on the horizon. The German range-takers saw hard, dark silhouettes against an orange sky and corrected calmly, salvo after salvo. Scharnhorst's third salvo hit Good Hope. The armored cruiser caught fire almost at once, and the flames worked from the forward superstructure into the middle of the ship. She was still firing when the blaze had gone through the main deck. At 53 minutes past 7, Good Hope blew up in a flash seen 20 miles away. She vanished from the surface of the ocean, taking Admiral Cradock and 920 officers and men with her. Not one man was saved. Monmouth burned from the opening salvos. Her forward turret was smashed almost immediately, and she went off into the dark with a growing list. Glasgow tried to close, but there was nothing she could do for a burning ship under German guns, and Captain Luce made the decision to go. At 10 that night, the light cruiser Nürnberg found Monmouth by the glow of her own fires. 18 degrees of list, turrets jammed, nothing left to answer with. She did not strike her colors. Nürnberg opened fire, and Monmouth went down with 735 men. In the dark of a sub-Antarctic night, there was no one and nothing to save them with. 1,661 British sailors. No German losses at all. The first defeat of a British squadron at sea in more than a century. But that victory carried a price von Spee did not advertise. His ships had shot away more than half their ammunition in 45 minutes. There was nowhere to refill the magazines, because half the world lay between him and the nearest German port. Every shell fired at Coronel was a shell that would not exist at the Falklands. The news reached London on the 3rd of November, and on that day there was a man sitting in the Admiralty who already knew the answer. Admiral Sir John Arbuthnot Fisher had taken the post of First Sea Lord on the 30th of October 1914, 2 days before Coronel. He was 73 years old, and he had held that same post 8 years earlier. He came back into the chair of Prince Louis of Battenberg, who had been forced out by the nationalist press. Battenberg was one of the finest seamen of his generation and had lived in Britain since he was 14. But he had a German name, and in November of 1914, that proved to be enough. Fisher walked into the Admiralty in precisely the week a national humiliation was playing itself out off the coast of Chile. During his first term, he had driven through the most radical reform of the British fleet in half a century. He struck hundreds of obsolete ships off the list, vessels which, in his own phrase, could neither fight nor run away, and only ate money. He concentrated force where force was needed and built the Grand Fleet into its modern shape. The admirals of the old school hated him, and he answered them in public and in the same terms. In that same year, 1906, he launched HMS Dreadnought and, with one ship, made every battleship in the world obsolete, including his own. Dreadnought carried 10 12-inch guns, where her predecessors carried 4, and she ran on turbines at 21 knots. Within a year, every navy on the planet was counting its battle line again, starting from zero. And in that same year, Fisher built a second ship that had never existed before at all. The word about Coronel landed on his desk on the 3rd of November, when he had not been a week in the job. The shock was total. The Royal Navy had not lost a fleet action since the War of 1812, and no British squadron had been annihilated since the 18th century. The problem went beyond prestige. Von Spee was loose in the South Atlantic with 5 cruisers. Through those waters passed British transports from Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and South America every single day. Marine insurance rates jumped the same day, and the commercial pressure on the Admiralty became enormous. Most men in Fisher's chair would have called a conference. Fisher wrote an order. On the 5th of November, 2 days after the news reached London, he signaled the Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Fleet, Admiral Jellicoe. HMS Invincible and HMS Inflexible were to be detached immediately and handed to Vice Admiral Sturdy, who would take command of the South Atlantic and Pacific. Jellicoe objected because pulling 2 battlecruisers off the North Sea meant weakening the main line of defense. Fisher ignored the objection. On the 11th of November, both ships left Devonport and turned south. 8 days from the news of a defeat to the right, ships being at sea. That is the speed of a man who did not need to think, because he had made the decision 8 years earlier when he signed the drawings. If you enjoy watching a design decision made 8 years before a battle decide the whole campaign, subscribe to the channel. Victory Vault runs a story like this every week. Now to what Fisher actually built and why it worked. The armored cruiser was a compromise, and it rested on a balance that satisfied nobody completely. Faster than a battleship, weaker than a battleship, medium caliber guns, medium armor, around 22 knots. Scharnhorst was one. Good Hope and Monmouth were the same idea, and the difference between them came down to crew training and luck with the light. Fisher looked at that compromise and proposed tearing it in half. His idea read as heresy to half the Admiralty. Take the 12-inch guns of a battleship, put them in a hull long enough and fine enough for 26 knots, and pay for that speed with armor. The logic was that a ship with that advantage in speed would dictate the range of every action. It would never be obliged to take a hit on the belt at all. Speed itself was the armor. That was the gamble. HMS Invincible was laid down in 1906, and on trials she touched 26 knots at around 17,000 tons. 8 12-inch guns in 4 turrets, and an armor belt of 6 inches. Exactly what Scharnhorst carried. Those guns are the heart of the whole story. The 12-inch BL Mark X had a barrel over 43 feet long and weighed 58 tons without its mounting. A complete turret with all its hoists and machinery ran to around 500 tons, roughly the weight of a small destroyer of the period. Invincible carried 4 of them. Her 12-inch shell weighed 850 pounds and left the muzzle at about 2,700 feet per second. Inside sat a lyddite burster on a delay fuse. It was designed to hold its charge through the armor and detonate once the shell was already inside the ship. Scharnhorst's shell weighed 238 pounds, 3.5 times lighter, and that ratio decides everything that happens on the 8th of December. At comparable muzzle velocity, the energy at impact scales with mass. At 14,000 yards, the German shell had no residual energy left to defeat 6 inches of armor plate. The British shell did. Add the speed to it. 26 knots against 22.5. 3.5 knots of difference meant von Spee could neither break away nor close the range by his own choice. These ships were built for one job above all others: run down an enemy cruiser on a trade route, sit at a range he cannot answer, and take him apart. Von Spee's squadron was precisely the prey Fisher had in mind when he signed those drawings. But Fisher had bought that speed with protection, and in 1914, nobody at the Admiralty believed it would ever matter. 6 inches was thin for a ship that might one day meet another heavy ship. 18 months later, it would matter a great deal. Hold on to that number. Now to von Spee himself, because without him this story falls apart into a list of specifications. Maximilian Graf von Spee commanded the East Asia Squadron, based at Tsingtao, the German concession on the Chinese coast. It was the most prestigious overseas command in the Kaiser's navy. 4 cruisers, white hulls, formal dinners, and gunnery that took the prizes year after year. In late July of 1914, when war became certain, von Spee gathered his captains aboard Scharnhorst and spread out a chart of the Pacific. He did not speak for long, and he offered no comfort. The Japanese would close the north, the Australians would close the south, the British were everywhere, and Tsingtao could not be held for a month. There was no direct route home. That left one option: run for the west coast of South America, where neutral Chile leaned German and where German merchant ships could pass coal. "I am quite homeless," he told his captains that day. "I cannot reach Germany, and we have no secure harbor anywhere. I must cruise the seas doing what damage I can until my ammunition is exhausted or until a superior force catches me." That was not a speech before a campaign. It was a sentence he passed on himself out loud, 4 months before it was carried out. What followed makes the whole story harder than it looks. 8,000 miles across the Pacific, the Marshalls, the Carolines, the Marquesas, Easter Island. German naval intelligence had positioned colliers across the ocean before the war, hidden under the cover of ordinary trade. Von Spee moved from one transfer point to the next, never staying longer than the 48 hours neutrality allowed. Coal came across in the open sea, hull to hull, by shovel and barrow. The men worked 12-hour shifts in coal dust, under equatorial sun or sub-Antarctic wind, and after every transfer the ship was scrubbed for a week. At the Caroline Islands, von Spee made one more decision that stands on its own. He detached the light cruiser Emden and sent her into the Indian Ocean to operate alone. Over the next 3 months, Emden sank or captured 23 vessels, shelled Madras and Penang, and tied down dozens of Allied warships hunting her. On the 9th of November 1914, the Australian cruiser Sydney ran her onto a reef at the Cocos Islands and destroyed her. When the Japanese fleet began combing the Pacific, von Spee was already in another sector. When HMAS Australia, a battlecruiser capable of destroying his whole squadron single-handed, came looking for him, he was running for the Chilean coast. He did not accept battle with anything stronger than himself. He disappeared. At Coronel, he met something weaker, and he did it flawlessly. After the victory, the German colony at Valparaiso threw him a reception with a band and flags. One of the guests stood up and proposed a toast to the damnation of the British Navy. Von Spee got up and walked out of the room. "I will not drink that toast," he explained afterwards, "because I know that fleet too well." That was professional judgment talking. He understood that one victory over a weak squadron changes nothing except how fast the answer comes. Then he added a line several officers wrote down. "Someone has handed me flowers from my own grave." He knew how it would end, and his next decision remains the least explicable thing in the entire story. On the 26th of November, von Spee assembled his captains aboard Scharnhorst again and put a plan to them. Attack the Falkland Islands, destroy the wireless station and the coaling station, lift what stores could be carried, and go on into the Atlantic. Almost every captain spoke against it, and their arguments were solid. There was coal enough because the squadron had just topped up from the merchant ships. The Falklands lay off the route home, and the raid gained nothing strategically, since the British would rebuild a wireless mast inside a month. Ammunition after Coronel stood at around 40%, which is not the state in which a squadron goes looking for a fight. The British had almost certainly reinforced the islands, because that was the most logical place to expect a German raid. Schönberg, captain of the Nürnberg, put it shortest of all. "Do not go near the Falklands. Anything at all could be waiting there." Von Spee let every man finish his argument to the end. He was that kind of commander. He listened. He did not interrupt. He let the thought run to its end. Then he ordered the squadron to sail. Nobody knows the reasons with certainty, and this remains the darkest patch in the whole campaign. Intelligence reported only Canopus at the islands, the old pre-dreadnought Cradock had left behind, and on that picture there was no risk at all. The British wireless station was coordinating the hunt for his squadron, and destroying it bought weeks of silence. Coal from the sheds extended his endurance. There is another explanation he never put into words. He knew he was not getting home. The British would close the Atlantic. There were no friendly ports. The ammunition could not be replaced, and sooner or later they would run him down. Dying in action, attacking the enemy, was a different thing from dying somewhere in open water, cornered without firing a shot. There is one more detail that makes the decision bitterer still. The colonial authorities on the Falklands sent a telegram stating that Canopus was leaving for South Africa, where a rebellion had broken out. The telegram was a forgery, put on the wire specifically to be intercepted by the Germans. Von Spee intercepted it and read it exactly as its authors intended. The islands were now uncovered entirely. He steamed for the Falklands, convinced there was not even an old battleship there. The squadron sailed on the 1st of December. On the 3rd, they rounded Cape Horn in weather unusually kind for those latitudes. On the 6th, they took the British collier Drumure, lifted her cargo and released her crew. On the 8th of December, the Falkland Islands came up over the horizon. And by that moment, ships that had no business being there had been sitting in Port Stanley harbor for 12 hours. Sturdy's squadron had come into Port Stanley on the evening of the 7th of December, 12 hours before Von Spee appeared on the horizon. It very nearly did not make it, and the reasons it did are worth listing. Vice Admiral Sir Frederick Doveton Sturdy was methodical to the point of tedium, and Fisher could not stand him. Their feud went back well before the war. Sturdy had taken Admiral Beresford's side in an older quarrel with Fisher, and Fisher never forgot it. There is a case to be made that sending Sturdy south was Fisher's way of getting him out of the Admiralty. Sturdy sat there as chief of the war staff, and here a detail surfaces that puts the entire story at a different angle. Sturdy held that post in exactly the weeks when the Admiralty was writing Cradock those ambiguous telegrams. The man who helped author the orders that sent Cradock to Coronel without reinforcement was now going to avenge him. He would do it with the very ships Cradock had been refused. He took the ships south at a pace that spared the machinery over a long passage, and he stopped where he judged he needed to. On the way to Abrolhos, off the Brazilian coast, the wires of the towed gunnery targets wound themselves around one of Invincible's shafts. The squadron had to stop and cut them free. At Abrolhos, Sturdy coaled and joined his reinforcements, the armoured cruisers Carnarvon, Cornwall, and Kent, and the light cruisers Bristol and Glasgow. Glasgow was the ship that had run from Coronel in the dark. Her captain, Luce, had lived through that night and understood better than anyone that every day lost cut the chance of ever finding Von Spee. He pressed Sturdy to shorten the stay and sail earlier than planned, and Sturdy gave way. That concession was worth 1 day. The trouble with the shaft cost several hours. Move either figure the other way, and the squadron arrives on the morning of the 8th of December, with Von Spee already on the horizon. It would have sat trapped in harbor with cold boilers. 12 hours stood between catastrophe and total victory. At 6 in the morning on the 8th of December, Invincible and Inflexible lay alongside with colliers against their hulls. They had coaled all night, the decks were black, and most of the boilers were cold. Raising steam for full power took an hour and a half to 2 hours, and sitting on the bottom of the harbor was Canopus. The decision to ground the old battleship had been taken by the governor of the islands back in November. By then it was clear Von Spee was somewhere in the Atlantic. Some of her guns were landed and mounted ashore. Her hull was flooded down, so she settled into the mud and stopped rolling, because a motionless platform shoots straighter. Spotting posts went up on the hills with a telephone line run out to them. Sturdy found the arrangement already built and waiting. An obsolete pre-dreadnought, written off every serious task, had become a fort with 12-inch guns. At 35 minutes past 7, the lookout post on the hill signaled down. 2 unidentified warships approaching the harbor. They were Gneisenau and Nuremberg, the advance guard sent in to look the harbor over before the attack. Their lookouts expected a coaling station with minimal cover. What they saw made no sense. Rising above the low ground were tripod masts, and tripod masts were fitted only to heavy warships of the new generation. Beside them stood columns of smoke far too thick for merchantmen. Captain Merker of the Gneisenau signaled the flagship exactly what he was looking at. Tripod masts in sight, probably battlecruisers. Then Canopus spoke. The old battleship fired blind over the spit of land, laying by compass bearing on data from the shore post. She missed, but the shells fell close around Gneisenau, and that was enough. The British were not merely in the harbor, they were ready to shoot. Aboard Scharnhorst, von Spee understood it in a single second. Battlecruisers. In the last place on Earth he could have expected them. He swung the squadron away from the harbor, turned southeast, and called for full speed. His flag officer proposed attacking at once, while the British lay without steam, and there was sense in it. 90 minutes of helplessness was the only opening he would ever get. Von Spee refused, because he could do the arithmetic. Even if he went into that harbor, in an hour and a half 2 battlecruisers would have full power, and he would be locked inside the bay. Behind him, chaos hardened into order. Colliers were cut loose, cables slipped, stokers threw coal into cold furnaces by the 100 shovel. Pressure climbed more slowly than anyone aboard wanted. At 8:30, Sturdy sounded action stations, and at 9:10, Invincible weighed and stood out for the harbor mouth. The day was clear, the sea flat, and visibility ran to the horizon. For a hunter, that is perfect weather, and von Spee had nowhere in it to hide. He had roughly 20 miles of start and a 3.5-knot deficit in speed. From there, it was pure arithmetic, and both admirals worked the same sum. For 3 hours, the British ships ran in silence, without opening fire. The range came down a few yards at a time, hour after hour, with the same certainty as a sum being worked out on paper. The German squadron held formation, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau in the rear, the 3 light cruisers nearer the head of the line. Aboard the German ships, those 3 hours counted differently. 3.5 knots of difference is invisible to the eye. In open water, it looks like a stationary dot on the horizon. But every 10 minutes, the officer of the watch took a bearing, and every 10 minutes, the smoke astern stood a little closer than the time before. By 1 o'clock, the rearmost German ships had come inside reach. Invincible opened fire at 5 minutes to 1 from around 14,000 yards, and that was an enormous range for the gunnery of 1914. Put a scale on it. 8 nautical miles. The shell was in the air about 20 seconds, arcing several kilometers high. In those 20 seconds, the target ship moved 200 meters. Hitting her meant firing at the point where she would be 20 seconds from now. You worked that point out from her course, her speed, and her helm. The first salvos threw up columns of white water around the rearmost German cruiser. Then the hunt turned dangerous. 31 boilers in each battlecruiser were running at full power. The coal smoke laid itself forward along the line of fire on a light following wind. Gunsmoke joined it. A gray curtain hung between Invincible's layers and the target, and the spotters lost Scharnhorst for minutes at a time. Salvo after salvo went into empty water. Von Spee had no such problem. His gunners turned out to be exactly what everyone said they were. They found the range to the British flagship, took it, and held it. Shells of 8.2 inches began landing on Invincible with the same precision that had twice won them the Kaiser's Cup. Invincible's gunnery officer, Lieutenant Commander Danhuether, kept the tally from the foretop and logged hit after hit. The finest gunners in the German Navy were doing everything right. They hit and hit and hit again, and it changed nothing. The shells were finding armor built to take blows 3.5 times heavier, and they burst against a hull that barely registered them. A splinter here, a small fire there, a ragged hole through a funnel. Men felt the strikes through the soles of their boots and went on serving the guns. Von Spee was fighting the one ship in the ocean he could not hurt, at a range he had not chosen. Every flawless salvo he fired only measured what that excellence was worth. And here Sturdy met the decision that settled the day. His layers were half blind in the smoke. Closing the range meant coming out of the curtain, getting his shooting under control, and finishing quickly. But short range handed the Kaiser's gunners the one position from which their shells could finally reach something that mattered. He could finish fast and take the risk. He could drag it out and stay safe. Sturdy turned away and opened the range to 16,000 yards. He let the smoke blow clear astern, waited for a clean sight, and went on firing. A slow killing instead of a quick one, and a certain one. Geography stood behind that choice. The nearest British dock able to take a battlecruiser lay 12,000 miles away. Serious damage to machinery or steering meant the ship stayed in the South Atlantic for months. The Grand Fleet in the North Sea would go without her. Sturdy was answerable for this action, and equally for where those two ships would be in 6 months. It was unheroic, and it was arithmetic, and the arithmetic belonged to him. From that range, a 12-inch shell went through Scharnhorst's armour. From that range, Scharnhorst's shell did not reach Invincible's armour at all. Everything after that was a question of time. Aboard Scharnhorst, von Spee was reading the same figures Sturdy was. By 2 in the afternoon, the position worked out to the end with no variance left. His guns did not reach the British at the range Sturdy was holding. His speed let him neither break away nor close. In the magazines, after Coronel and 4 months of practice, sat around 40% of the outfit, and every salvo shrank what remained. Sturdy did not know about the ammunition. Von Spee did. At 25 minutes past 1, he gave the order that was his own death warrant, and he signed it without hesitating. The 3 light cruisers, Leipzig, Dresden, and Nuremberg, were to scatter and make for the South American coast independently. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau would turn and go at the British battlecruisers. 2 armored cruisers were buying 3 light ones time with their own hulls and their own crews. Sturdy sent Kent, Cornwall, and Glasgow after the runners. He took the turn of the Scharnhorst himself and settled onto a parallel course with his 2 battlecruisers. For over 2 hours, the 2 flagships hammered at each other. Scharnhorst's speed began to fall. 18 knots, as 12-inch shells started reaching the boiler rooms. 15, as steam pressure dropped. 12, when fires came up against the coal bunkers, and some of the boilers had to be shut down by her own crew. By 4 in the afternoon, Scharnhorst was burning along the whole length of her hull. Observers on the British ships watched flame beating out of hatches and scuttles. They watched secondary ammunition cooking off above the superstructure in bright flashes, and they watched her settle and slow. Her funnels were shot clean through. Smoke and steam poured from her in one continuous cloud, and she carried a heavy list. Her turrets went on working. The shells fell closer and closer to her own side as her speed dropped, and the ensign never came down for a second. No German regulation described the situation of a ship burning from stem to stern and still fighting without a chance. That situation was not supposed to exist. At 17 minutes past 4, von Spee sent his last signal. It went to the captain of the Nuremberg, to that same Schönberg who 2 weeks earlier had told the Council of War, "Do not go near the Falklands. Anything at all could be waiting there." 4 words. Sie hatten doch recht. You were right after all. Then Scharnhorst's guns fell silent one by one, and the ship rolled onto her port side. The bow went under first. For a moment, the stern lifted clear with the screws still turning, and the battle ensign was still on the mast. Then Scharnhorst slid down and was gone. She took her entire crew with her. 52 officers and 788 men, including Vice Admiral Maximilian von Spee. 840 men. Not one survivor. The British ships passed slowly over the place where the German flagship had been a minute before, and put boats down. There was no one to pick up. No boats, no rafts, no men in the freezing water. Only wreckage, spreading oil, and albatrosses turning low over the spot. They did not linger. Gneisenau was still alive a few miles off, and the day's work was not finished. Gneisenau fought on for nearly 2 hours against 3 British ships at once. By 5 in the afternoon, her magazines were empty, and her gunners had gone over to practice shot. Inert projectiles, carried aboard only for firing at towed targets. It was all that was left. She could not hold more than 16 knots. Her guns were being knocked out one after another, and she was taking water. Sturdy ceased fire and gave her time to strike her colors. Gneisenau did not strike. Fire was reopened. At 5:20, the ship, immobilized and silent, her bunkers flooded, began going over. And Captain Merker ordered the seacocks opened and the ship abandoned. At 6:02, Gneisenau capsized and sank. British boats worked the freezing water to the limit and pulled out 187 men from a crew of 764. Some of those brought aboard died of exposure within the day. Captain Beamish of the Invincible recorded that his ship took up 108 men, of whom 14 died and were buried the following day. Across the horizon, 3 separate chases were running. Leipzig took on Glasgow and Cornwall and fought until her last shell. When there was nothing left to fire, her crew opened the seacocks. She rolled over and sank at 9:23, leaving 18 survivors. The Nuremberg's story went differently. She ran, and she nearly got away. Kent was older, heavier, and slower on paper, and she began to drop back. Worse, she was running out of coal. The arrival of the German squadron had cut short her refueling at Port Stanley. So her crew began burning the ship from the inside. Working parties tore out everything that would burn and carried it to the stokeholds. Wardroom furniture, wooden ladders, bulkheads, deck planking, boats. The stokers fed it into the furnaces by hand. Kent worked up to 24 knots, a speed she had never made in her entire service, and ran the Nuremberg down in 3 hours. At 5:30, Nuremberg turned and accepted action. An hour later, 2 of her boilers exploded, and at 7:27, she capsized and sank. 12 men were pulled from the water, and 5 of them died later. One of the dead was Otto von Spee. The admiral's other son, Heinrich, had gone down in Gneisenau a few hours earlier. The father and both sons went to the bottom of the South Atlantic on the same day, within a few miles of one another. Dresden got away. The only ship out of the entire squadron. For 3.5 months she hid in the maze of Tierra del Fuego. No coal, no spares, no signals, no hope. On the 14th of March, 1915, British cruisers found her in Cumberland Bay at Masatiera, the island known today as Robinson Crusoe Island. When they opened fire, her commander raised a white flag and asked for talks. While the talks went on, German officers opened the seacocks and took the crew ashore. Dresden went down under her own flag. The crew were interned in Chile, and one of her officers, a 28-year-old lieutenant named Wilhelm Canaris, escaped from the camp that August. He rode over the Andes in 2 weeks on papers naming him Reed Rosas, son of a Chilean father and an English mother. He reached Buenos Aires and was back in Germany by October of 1915. 20 years later, Admiral Canaris was running the Abwehr, German military intelligence. On the 9th of April, 1945, he was executed at Flossenburg concentration camp for his part in the resistance to Hitler, weeks before the war ended. History runs long threads. The account for the 8th of December, 1914. 4 German warships on the floor of the South Atlantic, 1,871 dead, and 215 men lifted out of the water onto British decks as prisoners. British losses, 10 killed, 19 wounded. Both battlecruisers took hits, and both went home under their own steam. The Falklands answered the question Coronel had asked in the cruelest way available. The question was never whether British sailors could fight. Cradock's men fought and died against a hopeless arithmetic, and not one of them struck his colors. The question was whether Britain would send the right ship for the work. To Colonel, she sent old cruisers with half-trained crews against the best gunners in the world, and the result was predictable. 5 weeks later, she sent the ships Fisher had drawn for exactly this task. The same German squadron, unbeatable off the Chilean coast, was wiped off the surface of the ocean in a single day. The same enemy, the opposite result. One parameter changed, the instrument. That is what makes the Falklands the cleanest proof of the battlecruiser idea in its entire history. Fisher promised a ship fast enough to catch any raider and strong enough to destroy him. The proof arrived 8,000 miles from home, against the best cruiser squadron Germany had. The consequences were immediate. The last German cruiser squadron capable of systematically threatening British shipping on the open ocean ceased to exist in 8 hours. Emden, the lone raider detached back in the Pacific, had already been destroyed by the Australian cruiser Sydney. There was no German naval ensign left in the Indian, Pacific, or South Atlantic Oceans at all. British trade routes in the Southern Hemisphere reopened, and insurance rates fell inside a week. Transports carrying troops from Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and South Africa sailed for Suez and on to the Western Front without heavy escort. There was no longer anything to escort them against. The battlecruisers went back to the North Sea, where they were needed. By 1915, Germany could not threaten those routes with surface ships at all. The war at sea tipped the way the Admiralty needed it to tip. In Britain, Sturdy was received as a national hero, and in January of 1916 he was given a baronetcy. Fisher was furious. He held that Sturdy had spent an unforgivable quantity of ammunition on an unnecessarily long action against an obviously weaker enemy. He refused to let him come home until Dresden had been sunk, and Churchill personally overruled the instruction. Fisher insisted the credit belonged to him, since the decision to send battlecruisers had been his. Sturdy, he said, had merely been lucky enough to find von Spee in his harbor. Some of those complaints were fair, and some were not. Sturdy genuinely could not gamble with battlecruisers for the sake of speed. He had 12,000 miles to the nearest British dock. But behind the reproaches sat something older than this battle, and inside that triumph sat a flaw that would one day cost Britain very dearly. The armour that shrugged off von Spee's light guns had never been designed to take a battleship's blow. Against 8.2-inch shells at extreme range, 6 inches held perfectly. Against heavier shells at close range, that same thin protection was a trap waiting for its moment. In 1914, nobody at the Admiralty believed the moment would ever come. It came 18 months later. HMS Invincible went on serving after the Falklands, the Mediterranean, the Dardanelles, then back to the Grand Fleet and the 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron under Rear Admiral Hood. On the 31st of May, 1916, she went into the Battle of Jutland. At 31 minutes past 6 in the evening, a German 12-inch shell struck Q turret amidships and went through its armored roof. The flash went down through open flash doors, straight into the magazine. Invincible broke in half. The explosion took 3 or 4 seconds. Bow and stern stood up out of the water as 2 separate wrecks. British ships passing by did not immediately understand they were looking at the remains of their own flagship. 6 men survived out of a crew of 1,026. One of the 6 was Hubert Dannhofer, the same gunnery officer who had stood in Invincible's foretop at the Falklands, keeping the tally of Scharnhorst's hits. He had watched the finest gunners in the Kaiser's Navy strike his ship with perfect accuracy and fail to do it any serious harm. At Jutland, he was aloft again, in the foretop, and the blast threw him outward instead of down. He came up in the water beside what was left of the ship. In his report to the Admiralty and to the King, he wrote one line that explains all of it. The ship had taken many hits, and her fighting efficiency remained complete until the moment a shell penetrated Q turret. What killed Invincible was not a German shell. It was open flash doors into a magazine, held open for the sake of loading speed. The Germans had run into the same problem earlier. At Dogger Bank in January of 1915, the cruiser Seydlitz came within moments of blowing up from an identical hit. She was saved only by flooding her after magazines by hand. The German command drew the conclusion in weeks and banned open flash doors in action outright. The British knew the incident in detail. They changed nothing. At Jutland, the British lost Invincible, Queen Mary, and Indefatigable to the same cause inside one day. Indefatigable blew up at 2 minutes past 4 and took 1,017 men. 2 survived. Queen Mary blew up 24 minutes later and took 1,266. 9 survived. Invincible broke in half at 31 minutes past 6 and took 1,026. 6 survived. 3 ships, more than 3,300 men, 17 survivors between them. All 3 died the same way. A hit on a turret, flash through open doors, the magazine gone. Admiral Beatty, watching his ships explode, said a line that has been quoted ever since. "There seems to be something wrong with our bloody ships today." He was right, and the problem was not in the design. It was in the regulation. The same thin armor that gave Invincible her speed and let Sturdy choose a safe range at the Falklands let a German shell reach her magazine at Jutland. The idea that one here so completely carried the seed of that catastrophe from the day it was drawn. Fisher wrote that speed is armor. At the Falklands he was right, at Jutland he was wrong, and the whole difference came down to who was standing opposite and at what range. Go back to that harbor one last time, on the morning of the 8th of December. 2 great ships in their own coal dust, fires banked, half ready, and the smoke of the most dangerous squadron on any ocean coming up over the horizon. Between them and catastrophe stand a few hours of frantic work by stokers. By the evening of that same day, the squadron was on the floor of the South Atlantic. Her admiral and both of his sons were dead. Both battlecruisers went home almost untouched. Ships that at dawn were too slow to save themselves had, by sunset, run down and destroyed their enemy. A proud British squadron had not managed to scratch that same enemy 5 weeks earlier. Von Spee never got his answer. The answer was written 8 years before that morning. On the 30th of October, 1914, a 73-year-old admiral walked back into the Admiralty. On the 3rd of November, he read about Coronel. On the 5th, he gave the order. And on the 11th, 2 ships left Devonport. 8 days from the news to the sea, because the decision had been taken in 1906 when Fisher signed the drawings. Cradock saw the problem too. He wrote to the Admiralty about it several times in plain language, and he was not heard. He went into action without the right instrument, and 1,661 men died with him. Some of those telegrams he received came out of the staff where Sturdy sat. 5 weeks later, Sturdy brought to the Falklands the ships Cradock had been refused, and did in one day what Cradock could never have done. No document tells us whether he thought about that, standing on Invincible's bridge. It remains an open question, and there is no answer to it. Fisher saw the problem 8 years before it arose and built the answer in advance. Von Spee got nothing wrong at Coronel. His gunners were the best in the world, his tactics were flawless. He chose his position and waited for his light. At the Falklands, the same gunners shot with the same accuracy and hit again and again. Skill does not change the weight of a shell, and experience does not add range to a gun. Training does not make armor thicker. He was firing 238-pound shells at a problem that needed 850. In 2019, Scharnhorst was found at a depth of 1,610 meters, 98 nautical miles southeast of Port Stanley. The hull sits upright on an even keel, with her turrets in place. The search began in 2014, on the 100th anniversary of the battle, and produced nothing for 5 years. Where she went down at 17 minutes past 4, she stayed. Coronel asked the question. The Falklands closed it. The dead of Good Hope and Monmouth had their account settled, and the ocean was British again. And those 4 words Von Spee sent in his last minute went to the man who had warned him 2 weeks before. Sie hatten doch recht. If this story got you, hit like and subscribe. Victory Vault runs one story every week about how a battle gets decided, usually by the instrument in the hands of the man who is only the second best shot in the ocean. The next one is already finished.